Recording start. Zoom out. But
Well, good morning, dear students. We are back again, and let's now try to finish the story so we can discuss the uh, questions then. So remember, Sado has met the general, and the plan has been made that general would send the assassins, and they would quietly kill the American and remove his body. He's now back at home. He doesn't tell anything to Hana because obviously she would be frightened. So from here we pick up. He refused to allow anything but reason to be the atmosphere of his mind as he went into the room where the American was in bed. But as he opened the door, to his surprise, he found the young man out of bed and preparing to go into the garden. "What is this?" he exclaimed. "Who gave you permission to leave your room?" "I am not used to waiting for permissions," Tom said gaily. "Gosh, I feel pretty good again. But will the muscles on this side always feel stiff? Is it so?" Sado inquired, surprised. He forgot all else. So as soon as it comes to treating somebody, he forgets everything. He forgets all enmity. "Now I thought I had provided against that," he murmured. He lifted the edge of the man's shirt and gazed at the healing scars. "Massage may do it," he said, "if exercise does not." "It won't bother me much," the young man said. His young face was gaunt under the stubbly blonde beard. So देखिए, जैसा आपको पहले बताया था, stubbly, having stubbles, that is small growth of hair. So his beard had grown a little, and his young face looked lean and thin. "Say, doctor, I've got something I want to say to you. If I hadn't met a Jap like you, well, I wouldn't be alive today." "I know that." Sado bowed. Um, he could not, but he could not speak. "Sure, I know that," Tom went on warmly, his big thin hands gripping a chair with white at the knuckles. "I guess if all the Japs were like you, there wouldn't have been a war." "Perhaps," Sado said with difficulty. "And now I think you had better go back to bed." He helped the boy back into bed and then bowed. "Good night," he said. Sado slept badly that night. Time and time again he woke thinking he heard the rustling of the footsteps, the sound of a twig broken, or a stone displaced in the garden, a noise such as men might make who carry a burden. So he was anticipating that the assassins had come. The next morning he made excuse to go first into the guest room.
new file uploaded. The enemy pod MP4.
If the American were gone, he then could simply tell Hana that so the general had directed. But when he opened the door, he saw at once that there was on the pillow was the shaggy um, blonde head. He could hear the peaceful breathing of sleep, and he closed the door again quietly. He is asleep, he told Hannah. He is almost well to sleep like that. What shall we do with him? Hannah whispered her old refrain. Sado shook his head. I must decide in a day or two, he um, promised. But certainly he thought the second night must be the night. There rose a wind that night, and he listened to the sounds of bending boughs and whistling partitions. Hannah woke too. Ought we not to go and close the sick man's partitions? She asked. No, Sado said. He is able to do it now for himself. But the next morning, the American was still there. Then the third night, of course, must be the night. The wind changed to quiet rain, and the garden was full of sound of dripping eaves and running springs. Sado slept a little better, but he woke at a sound of a crash and leaped to his feet. What was that? Hannah cried. The baby woke at her voice and began to wail. I must go and see. But he held her and would not let her move. Sado, she cried, what is the matter with you? Don't go, he muttered, don't go. His terror infected her and she stood breathless, waiting. There were only there was only silence. Together they crept back into the bed, the baby between them. Yet when he opened the door of the guest room in the morning, there was the young man. He was very gay and had already washed and was now on his feet. He had asked for a razor yesterday and had shaved himself, and today there was a faint color in his cheek. I am well, he said joyously. Sado grew Sado drew his kimono around his weary body. He could not, he thought, decided suddenly go through another night. It was not that he cared for this young man's life. No, simply it was not worth the strain. So he decided that he would not wait for another night for assassins to come and kill him. So in this section, let's see then what will Dr. Sado do to get rid of the man. You are well, Sado agreed. He lowered his voice. You are so well that I think if I put my boat on the shore tonight with food and extra clothing in it, you might be able to row to that little island not far from the coast. It is so near the coast that it has not been worth fortifying. Nobody lives on it because in storm it is submerged. But this is not the season of storm. You could live there until you saw a Korean fishing boat pass by. They pass quite near the island because The water is many fathoms deep there. The young man stared at him, slowly comprehending. Do I have to? He asked. I think so, Sado said gently. You understand, it is not hidden that you are here. So, you see, even the American has developed that kind of love and affection for them that he doesn't want to leave the couple. That, or I mean, remember that the American is their enemy, and this boy belongs to the U.S. Navy. He's a soldier. Even then, he develops love for Japanese. This is amazing how love can generate love. जब इसे अपनापन मिला, मोहब्बत मिली, केयर मिली जापानीज से, तो सोल्जर होने के बावजूद उसके दिल में भी इनके लिए जगह बन गई और वो वहाँ से जाना नहीं चाह रहा था. But Sado, of course, explained that everyone knows about it. The young man nodded in perfect comprehension. He said, sorry, okay, he said simply. Sado did not see him again until evening. Uh, as soon as it was dark, he had dragged the stout boat down to the shore and in it put food and bottled water that he had bought secretly during the day, as well as two quilts he had bought at a pawn shop. The boat he tied to a post in the water, for the tide was high. There was no moon, and he worked without a flashlight. When he came to the house, he entered as though he was just back from his work, and so Hana knew nothing. Yumi was here today, she said as she served his supper. Though she was so modern, still she did not eat with him. Yumi cried over the baby. She went on with a sigh. She misses him so much. The servants will come back as soon as the foreigner is gone, Sado said. He went into the guest room that night before he went to bed himself and checked carefully the American's temperature, the state of the wound, and his heart and pulse. The pulse was irregular, but that was perhaps because of his excitement. The young man's pale lips were pressed together and his eyes burned. Only the scars on his neck were red. I realize you are saving my life again, he told Sado. Not at all, Sado said. It is only inconvenient to have you here any longer. He had hesitated a good deal about giving the man a flashlight, but he had decided to give it to him. After all, it was a small one, his own, which he used at night when he was cold. If your food runs out before you catch a boat, he said, signal me two flashes at the same instant at sun drops sun drops over the horizon. Do not signal in darkness, for it will be seen. If you are already there, but um, if you are all right but still there, signal me once. You will find fresh fish to eat, easy to catch, but you must eat them raw. A fire would be seen. Okay, the young man breathed. He was dressed now in the Japanese clothes which Sado had given him, and at the last moment, Sado wrapped a black cloth about his blond head. Now, Sado said. The young American, without a word, shook Sado's hand warmly and then walked quite well across the floor and down the steps into the darkness of the garden. Once or twice, Sado saw his light flash to find his way, but that would not be suspected. He waited until from the shore there was one more flash. Then he closed the partition. That night he slept. Now he is again in conversation with the general. You say the man escaped? The general asked faintly. He had been operated upon a week before, an emergency operation to which Sado had been called in the night. For 12 hours, Sado had not been sure the general would live. The gallbladder was much involved. Then the old man had begun to breathe deeply again and demand food. Sado had not been able to ask about the assassins. So far, he knew they had not, they had never come. The servants had returned, and Yumi had cleaned the guest room thoroughly as and had burned the sulfur in it to get rid of the white man's smell out of it. Look at the extent of hatred. Yumi burns sulfur to get the smell out of the room. Nobody said anything. Only the gardener was cross because he got behind with his chrysanthemum. But after a week, Sado felt the general was well enough to be spoken to about the prisoner. Yes, Excellency, he hesitated. Sado now said. He coughed, signifying that he had not uh, said all he might have said, but was unwilling to disturb the general further. But the old man opened his eyes suddenly. That prisoner, he said with some energy. Did I not promise you I would kill him for you? For you? You did, Excellency, Sado said. Well, well, the old man said in a tone of amazement. So I did, but you see, I was suffering a good deal. The truth is, I thought of nothing but myself. In short, I forgot my promise. So look at this. There arises a question is whether the general neglected his duty. Well, we would say partly he did. He should have remembered it, but because of his illness, he forgot it. I wondered, Your Excellency, Sado murmured. It was certainly very careless of me, the general said. But you understand it was not lack of patriotism or dereliction of duty. He looked anxiously at the doctor. If the matter should come out, you would understand that, wouldn't you? Certainly, Your Excellency, Sado said. He suddenly comprehended that the general was in the palm of his hand. Now he knew the weak point of the general, so the general could not harm him, and that as um, consequence, he himself was perfectly safe. I can swear to your loyalty, Excellency, he said to the old general, and to your zeal against the enemy. Look at the general's reaction. You are a good man, the general murmured and closed his eyes. You will be rewarded. So, just because he agreed with the general, so the general said you would be rewarded. That's the behavior of the army men and the rulers. But Sado, searching for the spot of black in the twilighted sea that night, had his reward. There was no prick of light in the dusk. No one was on the island. His prisoner was gone, safe, doubtless, for he had warned him to wait only for a Korean fishing boat. So that was the greatest reward that Sado could get, and he got his reward. So you see, he stood for a moment on the veranda, gazing out to the sea, from whence the young man had come uh, that other night, and into his mind, although without reason, there came other white faces he had known. Look, which white faces? The professor at whose house he had met Hannah, a dull man, and his wife had been a silly, talkative woman, in spite of her wish to be kind. He remembered his old teacher of anatomy, who um, had been so insistent on mercy with the knife, and then he remembered the face of his fat and slatternly landlady. He had his he had yes he had great difficulty in finding a place to live in in America because he was a Japanese. The Americans were full of prejudice, and it had been bitter to live in it. So obviously, just as bitterness was there in Japanese, so the bitterness was there in Americans as well. Knowing himself their superior, how he had despised the ignorant and dirty old woman who had at last consented to house him in her miserable home. He had once tried to be grateful to her because she had, in his last year, nursed him through influenza, but it was difficult, for she was no less repulsive to him in her kindness. Now he remembered the youthful, haggard face of the prisoner, white and repulsive. Still he didn't like him, but he thinks, strange, he thought, I wonder why I couldn't kill him. So you see, in spite of all, he could not kill him. So this then is the end of the story. I think we should take up questions in another video. So we stop here. Thank you very much.
Stop button.